For the past several months, one of the most critical waterways on the planet has been effectively closed, and the world's oil supply has been held at the mercy of a regime in Tehran that shows no signs of backing down. Now President Trump has launched what he is calling Project Freedom, a U.S. naval escort operation through the Strait of Hormuz, beginning this Monday, warning that any interference will, quote, have to be dealt with forcefully. Iran, for its part, has declared the strait will never return to its pre-war status. The stakes for global energy markets, for American credibility, and for the entire strategic balance of the Middle East could not be higher. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is Project Freedom a genuine strategic masterstroke, or is Trump walking America into an open-ended military commitment in the Persian Gulf?
Thanks, Emma. Look, let's call this what it is. This is America finally doing what America is supposed to do when the global economic order is under direct attack. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20% of the world's traded oil. It has been closed for months. And the response from the institutional foreign policy class, from the Brussels bureaucrats, from the Canberra mandarins, has been hand-wringing and diplomatic memos. Trump has looked at that situation and said, the United States Navy exists for precisely this moment. Douglas Murray has been arguing for years that the West's problem isn't capability, it's will. Well, here is will in action, with warships attached. The 1987 Operation Earnest Will proved that American naval escorts can restore freedom of navigation. Iran blinked then, and the economic pressure on Tehran right now is arguably even more severe than it was in the 1980s. My concern, Emma, and I'll be direct about this, is that Trump needs to make absolutely certain the rules of engagement are tight, the mission is clearly defined, and there is no ambiguity about what the United States will do if Iran interferes. Because ambiguity is what gets sailors killed.
But, Sophia, isn't there a risk that by launching a military escort operation while simultaneously saying very positive discussions are happening with Tehran, Trump is actually muddying his own message? Is this coherent strategy, or is it two contradictory signals running at the same time? And James, what's your take on this?
Well, look, here's what I think Sophia is missing. The dual-track approach isn't confusion, it's classic coercive diplomacy, and it has a reasonable historical track record. You project strength to make the diplomatic option more attractive. That's not mixed messaging, that's leverage. Where I get nervous, and this is the economist in me speaking, is the operational specifics. We're talking about a waterway where Iran has mines, drone swarms, fast attack boats, and a revolutionary guard that doesn't always answer to the same chain of command as the Iranian government that's supposedly having positive discussions with Washington. The CNBC reporting makes clear that vessels have been unable to pass for months. That's not just diplomatic posturing from Tehran. That's physical infrastructure of denial that the IRGC has built up. A naval escort doesn't sweep mines. It doesn't neutralize drone batteries on Iranian coastline. And if one of those escorted tankers gets hit, Trump faces a choice that has no good options: back down and destroy American credibility across the entire region, or escalate into something that was never part of the original political calculation.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that analysis is precisely the kind of thinking that kept Western navies sitting on their hands for the last several months while the world's oil supply was being held hostage. Yes, Iran has asymmetric capabilities. Yes, there are risks. There are always risks when you stand up to a belligerent regime. The question is whether the risk of action is greater than the risk of continued inaction. And when you're talking about 21 million barrels a day, when you're talking about supply chains that are broken across Asia, across Europe, across economies that have nothing to do with this conflict, the risk of inaction is catastrophic. Trump warned that interference will be dealt with forcefully. That's deterrence. That's the cheapest form of security ever invented. If you don't back that statement up, then you have a credibility crisis. But you back it up, and Iran knows what the United States military can do. And suddenly the calculation in Tehran changes very quickly.
Here's what I want to know, because this is the question that keeps me up at night. Iran's parliament has publicly declared the strait will never return to its pre-war state. That's not a negotiating position. That seems like a statement of ideological commitment. James, where do you see this going over the next 6 months? And is there any scenario here that doesn't end badly?
The way I see this playing out, there are really three trajectories, and none of them is comfortable. The optimistic read, and it's genuinely possible, is that Iran's economic position is so severely compromised by sanctions and the costs of this conflict that when confronted with American naval escorts and the credible threat of force, they calculate that the cost of confrontation outweighs any domestic political benefit, and the diplomatic track quietly produces a face-saving arrangement. That happened in 1987, and Tehran's economic pain today is arguably worse. But the second trajectory, which I think is actually more probable in the near term, is asymmetric harassment. Mines, drone attacks on commercial vessels near but not directly confronting American warships. The IRGC doing enough to show domestic audiences they haven't surrendered while avoiding direct engagement with the U.S. Navy. That creates a grinding, expensive, escalatory dynamic that nobody has a clean plan for. And the third trajectory, the risk here is real, is that the diplomatic track collapses, the escorts face sustained resistance, and Washington is forced to choose between a humiliating retreat or a military escalation that extends this conflict in ways that are unpredictable and potentially irreversible.
Here's what concerns me most. And this is the thing that the financial press keeps dancing around without saying directly. If Project Freedom is launched and it fails, if Iran successfully harasses or attacks an escorted vessel and the United States' response is measured and cautious, the signal that sends to every adversary, not just Tehran, but Beijing watching Taiwan Strait dynamics, not just Iran, but Russia watching Black Sea shipping, that signal is America blinked. The strait being closed for months was already damaging to American credibility as the guarantor of global order. A failed escort operation would be categorically worse, which is why Trump's language about forceful response isn't rhetoric. It's the structural foundation of the entire operation. The moment that language becomes hollow, the entire strategic architecture of deterrence in that region starts to crumble.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, as always, thank you both for a debate that was as heated as the Persian Gulf itself right now. One thing's certain tonight, somewhere in Tehran, someone is watching those American warships move into position and doing some very urgent arithmetic.